Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
When Vivi Armacost graduated college in 2022, she decided to move from Indianapolis to New York City. She says she and her roommate-to-be were making good money in their first jobs out of school. But when they started actually touring apartments, they realized it wasn't going to get them very far in the New York City rental market. Still, they were willing to do anything to make it work.
We were like, oh, let's do the one bedroom and let's try to fit two of us in here. Wait, maybe let's add your boyfriend in so we can afford it as well.
To recap, they went from looking for a 2-bedroom to a 1-bedroom. Then they added a boyfriend. Vivi would live behind a flex wall.
The kitchen counter would go into my room a little bit. I was like, oh.
New York is one of the most expensive cities for renters in the world, up there with Singapore, Zurich, and Geneva. And even before she got there, Vivi knew she was going to have to pay a lot.
I had reached out to my friends who had moved to New York City and asked how much money I should save up to move here, and they didn't tell me about this little broker fee thing.
In addition to those sky-high rents, bidding wars, and disappointing fifth-floor walk-ups, there's another thing that makes the New York rental market uniquely challenging. This little broker fee thing. A broker is someone who acts like a concierge for people looking for apartments, sharing open listings, taking them on tours, and helping with negotiations. They exist in most real estate markets, and usually they're hired by landlords. But in New York, the broker system works a little differently. Renters often have to pay for these brokers, even when they don't use or even ask for their services.
The most shocking thing was that I did all the work. They just showed up to open the door, and if anything, they sometimes even used a code to get into the apartment.
It was frustrating. Vivi had gone online, searched through apartment listings, found a place herself. She didn't need a broker to do any of that. But when she went to sign her lease, she, like so many New York City renters, had to pay this additional charge, 15% of her annual rent, to a broker whose services she didn't choose to use. Before even getting into rent itself, how much did you pay upfront to move into this apartment?
I'm doing a little math on this side. I'm almost positive it was $8,000. I was broke when we moved to New York. I was we just paid $8,000. That's basically all I'm worth.
Vivi's not the first person to be surprised and annoyed by New York City's broker fee system, which has plagued renters for decades. But last week, New York City Council passed a new bill that aims to flip the model on its head. Today on the show, New York City's attempt to shift broker fees to landlords, how the real estate industry is reacting, and what it could mean for renters in one of the most expensive cities in the world. This is the Big Take Podcast. I'm Sarah Holder. The cost of living in New York City has been rising for decades.
New York City rents grew 7 times faster than wages in the city last year. So that's one of the largest gaps in the country.
That's Paulina Cachero. She covers residential real estate for Bloomberg.
If you look at new leases that were signed in October, the median rent in Manhattan was $4,295. And in Brooklyn, it's not that much cheaper as $3,600. So you can imagine that this is one of the most expensive cities to live in the world.
What is driving the increase in rents in New York City?
This is a complicated question. I think everyone wants to know why the rents are so damn high in New York City. But I think at its core, it's an issue with an imbalance in supply and demand.
Over the past decade or so, New York City created 800,000 jobs, but only enough housing for a quarter of those workers. But beyond the housing shortage, another reason the rental market is so hot is high interest rates.
The Federal Reserve increased interest rates at the fastest clip in decades, and people that had hoped to be able to buy a home, buy a condo, or buy a co-op in New York City are stuck renting. So all these people that, would have released more apartment inventory are staying in the rental market. So there's just been a lot of pressure on the demand side, and supply has not been keeping up.
The same dynamics squeezing New York renters are playing out across the country. There's a national housing shortage to the tune of 4.5 million homes, according to an analysis from Zillow. Over half of U.S. renters are rent-burdened, meaning they spend more than 30% of their income on rent. And the Cleveland Fed says rental inflation could take until 2026 to cool down. But there are some things that make this problem particularly brutal in New York.
New York City's rental market is so quirky. I think anyone who has gone through the process will realize how cumbersome it is. There's a lot of requirements to rent in New York City. To even qualify to apply for some apartments, you have to make 40 times the rent. And if you can't afford that, you need a guarantor. But on top of that, you also have broker's fees.
Broker's fees. That upfront charge for a real estate broker that tenants often have to pay when signing a lease. In New York, the charge can be up to 15% of a tenant's annual rent.
Street Easy estimated that the average move-in costs, including broker's fees that people pay before they even move into an apartment, is close to $13,000.
Real estate brokers can help make the apartment search easier, especially in cities with competitive markets. They post listings, set up apartment tours, vet buildings. But the internet has made it a lot easier for people to do a lot of this work themselves. So renters, especially renters on a budget, might choose to avoid working with a broker at all. But in 2 U.S. cities, New York and Boston, they may still have to pay one. Because even if it's the apartment landlord who hires the broker, tenants are often asked to foot the bill. And it's been that way as long as most residents and most brokers can remember.
Because there's so little inventory available, because people always want to move to New York, because there are so many people here, that keeps pushing rents up. And it's also the reason that we have the fee structure that we see today.
That's Anna Klenkar. She's a broker with Sotheby's. She says she doesn't know exactly why New York's broker fee system has held on for so long, but she has some guesses.
My belief, both Boston and New York are very long established cities that have a very high proportion of renters. They have a lot of schools, a lot of students. The rental market has also been largely consolidated. There are more very, very large landlords who own thousands of units, which further increases the imbalance of power.
I think it's just a function of New York City being a really competitive place.
Bloomberg's Paulina Cachero again.
It's just become standard practice in New York that if you don't pay, well, someone else is going to get the apartment over you. If you talk to the Real Estate Board of New York, they will tell you that the broker's fee has always been negotiable. You can talk to the agent about whether you want to pay it or not. But realistically, when there are 10 other people in line who have applied for the same apartment, if you're not willing to pay the broker's fees, they're going to go with someone else who is. So it kind of has become a pay-to-play market in New York with broker's fees. But a recent act has changed that.
A recent act introduced by New York City Councilmember Chi Ossé.
The first and only Gen Z elected official in New York State.
Ossé represents the 36th district, made up of Bed-Stuy and Northern Crown Heights. Last year, he moved out of his parents' house and entered the Wild West of the New York City apartment search. It was terrible.
How am I, as a member of the city council who I am making six figures, why am I having this much trouble finding an apartment? Why is it so expensive?
One of his biggest pain points was that upfront broker fee. He too was confused why renters had to pay it. But he realized that on the city council, he could actually do something about it. So he introduced legislation called the Fairness in Apartment Rental Expenses Act, or the FAIR Act.
It would require that simply whoever hires a broker within the city of New York pays for the broker fee.
It's not the first time someone's tried to challenge the broker fee model in New York. A similar change was implemented briefly in 2020 before being rolled back after the Real Estate Board of New York, or REBNY, a real estate industry trade group, filed a lawsuit to overturn it. Ossé himself first tried to overhaul the system over a year ago, and the legislation never made it to a vote. But last week, the FAIR Act was approved by the City Council, 42-8.
The main goal of this bill was to eliminate that upfront cost that New Yorkers find themselves paying to move into a new apartment in our already unaffordable housing market. Many New Yorkers do not have saving accounts. Many New Yorkers are living paycheck to paycheck. That upfront cost can really hold some people back. And eliminating that will allow for so many tenants to have more mobility in moving around our city. When we ban forced broker fees in New York City, it will give tenants more bargaining power, allow them to be more mobile, and it will allow them to decide on if they want to move out of their apartment if their landlord is charging more, which I believe will put a downward pressure on rents.
When we come back, what the Fair Act's critics have to say about the legislation. There are big changes coming for how renters find housing and how real estate brokers get paid in New York City. And Councilmember Chi Ossé hopes these changes will make the apartment search cheaper for tenants and more transparent for everyone. But members of REBNY, the local trade group representing brokers, landlords, and property managers, have been vocal opponents of such legislation for years. They argue that shifting the responsibility of paying for the broker to whoever hires the broker could have some unintended consequences.
I think there's this assumption that the money comes out of the landlord's pocket. It does not. It gets baked into the rent, and it's paid over time by the tenant.
Sarah Salzberg is co-founder and principal broker at Bohemia Realty Group, a brokerage firm that works with clients in New York City. She's a member of REBNY. And she says even if tenants might no longer be the ones paying brokers directly, they'll still be paying. She argues that landlords will just pass on those fees through rent increases. Instead of a one-time fee, Sarah says tenants could be paying more over multiple years. I asked Ossé about this.
First and foremost, 47% of homes for tenants within New York City are rent stabilized. So due to rent stabilization laws, it would be illegal for landlords to bake the fee into those apartments. 2, rents are set by market forces, not by what landlords can charge. If your landlord could increase your rent tomorrow, they would have done so yesterday.
But Sarah says she's also concerned that the Fair Act will make it harder to find an apartment at all. Because, she argues, brokers will only list units they're being paid by a landlord to advertise. Bloomberg's Paulina Cachero says a lot of the fallout from the Fair Act will depend on how landlords choose to react, whether they keep hiring brokers, and how they choose to cover those costs. Some of the experts Paulina spoke to said rents could go up in the short term. But supporters of the legislation told her that if landlords try to make up for the cost by spreading it out across rents slightly over time, that's still better than keeping New Yorkers locked in their leases with prohibitive upfront moving costs.
I think that a lot of the housing advocates still supported the bill because it provides people more mobility, more options. I think a lot of people were stuck in not ideal housing situations just because the upfront costs of moving anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000 is astronomical, and that's really hard for a lot of people.
The bill has passed most of its political hurdles. The mayor still has to sign it, but it has a veto-proof majority from the city council, and it's set to take effect next year. Still, REBNY, the real estate trade group, told us they'll, quote, continue to pursue all options to fight against this harmful legislation, unquote. But not all brokers are resisting the change. Anna Klenkar, the broker from Sotheby's we heard from earlier, actually helped Councilmember Ossé with the legislation.
No bill's perfect, but I think we've come pretty close. There's no actual benefit to a tenant pays situation. It only exists because of leverage. Because a lot of the work that you do when you list an apartment on the landlord side, it's for the landlord. So the landlord should be the one to pay for it.
Anna also thinks it could help brokers shake the negative reputation they have among some tenants, that they're getting paid to essentially unlock a door. She hopes this legislation will tip the scales, that when renters don't feel obligated to pay for a broker service they didn't ask for, they'll feel better about hiring brokers when they actually want them. Like Ossé did.
My experience in finding a home was so difficult that I hired a broker myself, and I think that shocks a lot of people because they think that I'm anti-broker and pushing this bill. I'm not anti-broker. I'm anti-forcing people to pay for something they didn't hire, right? I hired a broker who did a fabulous job in finding me an apartment. I believe individuals like him will stay in business.
Vivi, the renter who came to New York City a couple years ago, has moved since that first snug one-bedroom. She says she's happy in her current place. But then I let her know that the Fair Act had been passed.
You'll probably see me move in this summer, if so.
Thanks for listening to The Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm Sarah Holder. This episode was produced by Julia Press. It was edited by Aaron Edwards and Christine Morris. It was mixed by Alex Sugiura and fact-checked by Adriana Tapia. Naomi Shavin is our senior producer. Elizabeth Ponso is our senior editor. Nicole Beamsterboer is our executive producer. Sage Bauman is Bloomberg's head of podcasts. Please follow and review The Big Take wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps new listeners find the show. We'll be back next week.